Alright, so my talk is about threshold key destruction. As I said, I'm Joop. I'm from Trade of Bits. We mostly do audits. I do audits of cryptography software. And the topic I want to talk about today is one that I feel is a little bit underserved by the academic community. So I'm a cryptographer, but I feel like if you read academic cryptography papers, they don't always, cover all the issues that you might encounter in practice when you try to implement some of this stuff. So that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to explain later what it is. So I know this is not encrypt, this is SecureFi, so I'm going to assume that nobody here knows anything about cryptography, and I'm going to explain everything from scratch, which means that since this is only a 30-minute talk, everything will be extremely high level, but hopefully understandable. So I'm going to start talking about threshold cryptography, basically explain what cryptography is and what threshold cryptography is, and try to give an idea why I believe that this topic doesn't often come up in academia. Then I want to explain what I mean by threshold key destruction and why it's an issue. And finally, I'm going to give 3 examples about real cases of, let's say, threshold key destruction attacks we saw in practice, or maybe not real attacks, but implementations that were vulnerable to these kind of attacks. Okay, so cryptography is basically about securing communication. And the main goals that cryptographers often have when talking about securing communication is that you want to keep things secret, or in fancy words, to maintain confidentiality, and you want to know who you're talking to. Or in fancy words, you want to maintain the integrity or authenticity of the stuff you're communicating. So people should not be able to change things, they should be able to know who the things are coming from. There's another kind of topic here called availability. But when you talk to cryptographers, they often don't really care about availability, because cryptographic primitives are designed to be resistant in the scenario where the attacker controls the network and just can prevent any communication at all. So in the threat model that cryptographers typically operate, denial of service is not really a real threat, because it can always be done at any moment. And the only thing you need to know about cryptography to understand the rest of this talk is that most of it works using something called keys. So if you have the key, you can do an operation. If you don't have the key, you can't do the operation. So after figuring out how to do this secure communication, cryptographers thought, okay, it's nice that we can communicate, but what if we could also compute stuff together? So that's why I invented something called multiparty computation, where there are several people that want to work together to compute something, but they all have some secret input that they don't want the other parties to learn. And how they do this is they execute some kind of protocol, exchanging messages in a number of rounds. I'm not really going to go into detail exactly how this works. But in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to use this kind of example with a little diagram with some colored dots and arrows with a specific meaning. So MPC protocols always have a number of participants. In my examples, it will always be 3. And then participants can either be honest, which I will color green. If the participant is colored red, then they are malicious, kind of attacker. And if they're colored orange, then they are honest, but they think that something is wrong. So they want to abort or get some help. They don't want to continue. Now, in multi-party computation, another important concept is the idea of a threshold. So here we have 3 parties, but in fact, we only need 2 parties to do the computation. So this is called the threshold, which is the number of parties you need to do the thing you want to do. And for the security of multi-party computation, it's always important that the number of malicious parties is lower than the threshold, because otherwise the malicious parties can just get together and do the operation, which would be bad. So now that cryptographers, they figured out how to do secure communication, and they used the secure communication to do this nice multi-party computation. And then they decided, you know what, we're just going to go back and use multi-party computation to do cryptography. So basically, this is what's called threshold cryptography, which is where you take multi-party computation, and the function that you want to compute is just some cryptographic operation. And the secret inputs that the different parties have is just the key of this cryptographic operation, split into different shares for each of the parties. So how does it typically work? Well, first, all the parties have to get together to agree on a key. And this is called distributed key generation. So they run through an MPC protocol where they randomly generate a key such that each party gets a different part of the key. Given these key shares, or these parts of the key, they can now run the cryptographic operation, which is another MPC protocol where you only need the threshold number of participants. So in our example, you would need 2 participants. And then you can do the cryptographic operation that you want to do. So for example, encryption, typically you would use it for decryption, or you can do, for example, threshold signing, digital signatures. Now an important concept here is key refresh, which is where the participants get together to refresh the key. So basically what this means is that you take the old key shares that you have and you turn them into new key shares. And why would you want to do that? Well, here's an example. So we have 3 participants, they have some key that they share, each of them has a different part of it. So one has a blue K, the other one has a yellow Y, and then the third one has a purple E. However, this third party messed something up. Maybe they hired the wrong audit company, or maybe one of their developers accepted a job for a company that turned out to be North Korea, but they were compromised. So their share is now no longer safe. Somebody else has it. So this is where you would apply key refresh. Basically, you run through a protocol where the shares of the key are re-randomized in a way such that you can throw away the old key shares and the new key shares have no relation to the old key shares. And this is useful because then this compromised key share that the third party had before is no longer useful, because as long as the other honest parties deleted their blue K and the yellow Y, this purple E is useless. It really is completely meaningless. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is key destruction. But before I explain really what this is, I want to point out one thing, which is that the most vulnerable that the cryptographic key is in this context is when you're doing operations on it, not with it. So in this case, that would be during distributed key generation, when you're generating the key, or during key refresh, when you're updating the key shares. So those are the, let's say, easiest places to do an attack which would cause the destruction of the key. And typically, if you destroy the key during key generation, it's not very, you don't achieve a lot. Because at this point, the key has not been used for anything. So you have destroyed something which people wanted to use, but haven't used yet, which is annoying, but it's not really, let's say, that bad. However, if a key has been used to do some stuff, and then during the key refresh you destroy it, this is extremely bad. So imagine that you're using the key to, control the access to some funds, and now during a refresh phase, the key gets destroyed. Now nobody can access these funds, which is obviously something we would like to avoid. Okay, so what do I understand with key destruction, and why do I believe it's not really covered that well in the existing literature? So typically, cryptographers care about attackers that break the security in the following way. So they either obtain the key and then use this key to do the cryptographic operation that people do, like decrypt messages or forge signatures. So again, in the example where you use the key to protect access to some funds, what the attacker will now do is they will just steal the funds. So they take the key and they steal the funds. However, the attack that I want to talk about is kind of different than this. It's an attacker that makes the system more secure in a way. So instead of stealing the key and stealing the funds, they make it sure that nobody can use the key, which is very secure, because then nobody can steal the funds. But in fact, that's not really what funds are for. They're meant to be used. So this is very bad. It's a kind of denial of service attack. But it's not like the kind of denial of service attack that we were talking about before, where somebody can just block some messages from happening. Because it's not like you can just pay some extra money to your content delivery network to, fix this denial of service, because it means that nobody can use the key ever again. And if the cryptography is secure, it means you can't recover the funds. So the attack that I want to talk about today is where the attacker ensures that the key cannot be used, and in the worst case, they can even achieve something where the key can still be used, but only if the attacker allows it. So they can ransom the key, and therefore, for example, the funds that are protected by this key. So before I continue, I just want to mention that this concept only makes sense in something called the honest majority setting. So when you're talking about MPC, you can pick the threshold at any number of participants. But if you pick it above, let's say, half of the participants, that means that you require that at least half of the participants, a majority, is honest, because otherwise you can just break the key, retrieve the key as a group of malicious participants. So in that setting, the key can be destroyed very easily because the malicious parties will just refuse to use it. If they just refuse to use the key, then nobody can do anything. So the threshold key destruction attacks I want to talk about now only make sense in the honest majority setting, where the threshold is, let's say, larger than the half the number of the participants. Okay, so now I want to talk about the first example, which comes from a paper published in 2020, presented by Omerson and Shlomovitz at Black Hat USA. And it targets something called Feldman verified secret sharing. You don't really need to know what this is or how it works. You just should know that it's a popular one that's used by most MPC deployments out there. So how it works is that there are, in Feldman verified secret sharing, there are 2 rounds in the key refresh at the minimum, which is in the first round, people commit to some stuff, and then in the second round, they send the actual things that are needed to update the key, and then you have to verify whether this matches the commitments and whether it's all well formed and so on. And what Omerson and Shlomovitz said is that they looked at a bunch of implementations out there, and they found a bunch of these implementations that were not secure in the following way. So when something went wrong in the second round of this protocol, the participants would not tell each other. So there would be some participants that thought everything went okay, I can delete my old share. And there would be some other participants that thought, okay, something went wrong, I don't have a new share, I need to keep my old share. And what happens now is that you have a kind of fork in the consensus, which is that in our example with 3 players, there's one honest party that throws away the old share and keeps the new share. There's another honest party that doesn't have a new share and has to keep the old share. And then there's a malicious party who can keep both shares because they know what's going on. So now, with a threshold of 2, the only way that you can still do something is with the help of the malicious party. So they have kind of taken control of the key in such a way that they can ransom access to the key, which they can use to extract money from people that want to recover this key. So what they suggested is you need to add a confirmation round where everybody broadcasts their result of this protocol, and if something went wrong, this will now be detected. So in this case, for example, the party that detected something went wrong broadcasts to everybody something went wrong, and now everybody knows something went wrong. However, if you know something about consensus, you should be feeling a little bit uneasy right about now, because this whole thing is a problem in consensus, and we're saying okay, there was no consensus before, we just gotta add another round, and now there will be consensus. So why doesn't this always work? Well, the attacker can just move the attack to the confirmation round instead. So instead of doing the attack in the second round, in the confirmation round, they kind of cheat on the broadcast and they say, okay, we're gonna send something went wrong to one party and everything was okay to another party. So then people might say, okay, the broadcast is insecure. You should have a more reliable broadcast. So why don't we replace it by echo broadcast, where we, echo everything that everybody sent during the broadcast so we can see that something went wrong or not. Well, that's fine, but now the attacker can attack the echo. And you can just keep on adding rounds, but eventually you realize that this will not solve your problem. Because what you're dealing with here is a Byzantine fault, and you need a Byzantine fault-tolerant way to detect this. So, for example, you need to run something like Paxos to get consensus between all the nodes in this case. Or everybody should post their result of this key refresh, like whether it was successful or not, to the blockchain, so that you can see that you can, let's say, reuse the fault tolerance of the blockchain to implement this reliable broadcast. But unfortunately, this is not really written in the paper, because academic papers typically say you need to have reliable broadcast and then leave it to the implementers to sort out this problem, which isn't always done correctly. Okay, so that was the first example. Now I want to move on to the next example, which is, it's the same algorithm, but a different attack. So again, I'm not going to explain exactly how Feldman verifiable secret sharing works, but you just need to know that during this protocol, the parties send a bunch of stuff to each other, and the length of these things corresponds to the threshold. So in our example, the threshold is 2, so everybody sends 2 elements of something to the other parties. So what happens now if somebody sends longer things? So a malicious participant sends a bunch of longer stuff. So instead of length 2, they send length 4. So it turns out that if other participants don't check the length properly, then without people knowing, the threshold is increased. So what happens here is that the malicious party sends something of length 4, the threshold is now 4, which means you need 4 participants to do the operation, except there are only 3 participants. So this means that the key cannot be used in some sense, because there are not enough shares for people to reach the threshold. What's even worse is that the key can be recovered, but only with the help of the attacker. The reason for that is a little bit technical, like this is all based on polynomials of a certain degree, and the attacker is the only one who knows the polynomial of the higher degree that can be used to recover the key shares. It's not super important, but just trust me that the attacker can still help recover the key together with the other parties. So again, this can be used to ransom, to hold the key ransom. Now you might ask, okay, but this is just an implementation mistake, right? So you should always check the length of things you receive, and you would be correct. But in fact, we did find 10 vulnerable open source implementations. And I think the reason for this is that everybody wants to rewrite their implementation in Rust or in Go or whatever. And you have this nice thing where you avoid, index out of bound errors in array access. So you just say 4 element in array, do some stuff, and then you're happy. But if you didn't check that the array was the correct length, you're processing everything just without thinking about it, and then this happens. So if you want to find more information about this vulnerability, you can read our blog. You can see which are the vulnerable repositories that we found, and read more about it. So then I want to move to the third and last example that I want to discuss. So this one's a bit more complicated. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's about DKLS23, which is a way to do threshold signatures for ECDSA based on oblivious transfer. Again, I don't really have the time to explain how oblivious transfer works and what it is. The only thing you should know is that the way this is applied in this algorithm is that there is a particular thing that can happen during the algorithm where if something fails, because an attacker is doing something bad, then the behavior of the honest parties can tell the attacker something about the secret bits of these honest parties. And if you allow this to be repeated over multiple executions of the protocol, then we eventually learn the whole private key share, which would be very bad. So that's why the protocol has this specific line in the description of it saying, okay, if something goes wrong in one of these steps, because some party messed up, you need to stop cooperating with this party. You need to abort all the current sessions that you're running in parallel with this party, and you need to stop working with them forever. You should never work with them again. Which is a very, let's say, kind of extreme measure to take, but at least it keeps you secure from, let's say, giving your key to an attacker. However, that gave us the idea to say, like, okay, when somebody thinks another party is malicious, they will not sign with this party anymore. But it also means that if honest parties are ever tricked into thinking that other honest parties are malicious, they will not cooperate anymore. And if you get enough distrust in the whole graph of, let's say, all the participants, then nobody can sign anymore because nobody trusts anybody else. And in fact, we found quite a lot of issues in existing libraries that would allow you to do such an attack. So the first one is that typically this sort of protocol is implemented in a library, and then users of this library just use the library to run the protocol, and then they have to take care of some things like key storage and so on, but the library takes care of the rest. And one thing we found in several libraries actually is that when this error is generated inside the protocol that says, okay, this is a bad event where an attacker might learn something, they don't actually tell the user who was the bad party. So this means that the honest user now has, if this happens, has two choices. One, they can distrust everybody that was part of this protocol run. And the other one is that they can just accept it and say, okay, well, over time I might lose my key. So they have to choose between, let's say, accelerating this denial of service that destroys the key, or potentially later losing access to the key because an attacker learns it. Which is, kind of choosing between a rock and a hard place, so it's not very nice. So it's very important that this library is implementing this protocol, either take care of this for the user inside the library, or they need to give the user enough information so that they can make the right decisions by themselves. Another issue we found in some libraries is that all of these MPC academic papers, they tell you need secure peer-to-peer communication, which means you need to have authenticated and encrypted channels to talk to the other parties, which is a nice thing to write down in the paper, but it's quite difficult to implement in practice. And very often there are minor mistakes that can lead to disastrous results. So one thing that we found, for example, is that there was a library where there was something wrong with the authentication part of the peer-to-peer communication. So an attacker could flip bits in some messages. So basically what you can do now is that you can take some of these messages that are related to the OT extension, which is where this failure can happen. And by flipping bits there, you with high probability will trigger this failure. And as a result, those two honest parties will distrust each other, even though the malicious party was not involved with them at all. Another nice example is a case where broadcast communication was not, or was kind of the issue. So basically these OT protocols and OT extension protocols have to be unique in every signature session. So one way to achieve that is by giving every signature execution a unique session identifier, and then using this to instantiate these OT peer-to-peer protocols. But now it turns out that if an attacker messes up with the broadcast, and he says, so basically these session IDs are typically constructed by all the parties together. So if the malicious party sends one session ID to one participant and another session ID to another participant, these participants don't agree on the session ID. And then if they try to use this, let's say, different session ID to instantiate the OT, it will cause a failure at the place where you expect. So if this is the first place where you will detect that your session IDs are not aligned, then it will again cause distrust between honest parties. So this is kind of a subtle issue that can be, it can go wrong in many different places in implementations in practice. So now I just want to reinforce, let's say, what was the point of this talk? Why was I talking here about trusted key destruction? I think what I want to make clear is that we encounter these kind of issues a lot during audits. And while it doesn't seem like they're being exploited as much today, because probably there's lower hanging fruit, there are ways that people can recover key shares, compromise enough key shares to get a threshold, as discussed also in the talks earlier today. Once those lower hanging fruit are more locked down, then these more advanced attacks also come into play. And it just is very important that you keep in mind that participants can act maliciously, either because they're compromised or because they have a financial incentive. So you can't just hope that all the participants will act honestly, because if that's the threat model you're working under, you can just not do any MPC at all and just pick one validator or one node every time to make the decision, because you can trust them anyway. And it's not just that this can lead to loss of funds, but there are also avenues where the attacker can ransom the keys, as I've shown, which is very bad because then they have a direct financial incentive to mount this kind of attack because they will get paid for giving the key back. So what do we recommend that you do to mitigate these kind of attacks? First of all, it's good to have a kind of backup or recovery process in place. So if something goes wrong, let's say in the wider network, with your keys becoming inaccessible, that you have another way to recover this key. Maybe it's stored in an HSM or something, or maybe copies of shares are stored in an HSM. There should just be some way that you can either recover the key or recover whatever the key is protecting. Besides that, there's the obvious, general good advice, which is that you should always validate what other parties have sent before you process them. So, for example, the length of things. And you should also ensure that peer-to-peer and broadcast communication are properly implemented, and that the ones that you implement are sufficient for the goals you're trying to achieve. Like, if you need Byzantine fault tolerance, make sure that your broadcast supports this as well. If you like this talk and you like thinking about these sort of issues with real implementations, our blockchain team is also hiring. And that's it.